Comenzaremos ahora el diálogo interactivo con la Comisión Internacional de Expertos en Derechos Humanos sobre Etiopía, de conformidad con la resolución del Consejo S33/1. La lista de oradores se cerrará en 15 minutos. Es para mí es un placer dar la bienvenida a los distinguidos miembros de la Comisión, la señora Kaari Betty Murungi, el señor Stephen Ratner y la señora Radhika Kumaraswamy. Le doy la palabra a la presidenta de la Comisión, la señora Kaari Betty Murungi.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Excellencies. Good morning. The United Nations International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia presents its report to the Human Rights Council at a challenging and perilous time for Ethiopia and its people. After a 5-month cessation of hostilities, fighting resumed last month between the federal government and its allies and forces backing the TPLF. That fighting appears to be intensifying. Credible sources indicate an escalation in drone attacks employing explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. The suspension of UN humanitarian access into Tigray since late August 2022 and reports of involvement by Eritrean forces along the border. Ethiopia's beleaguered civilian population now finds itself mired once again in the intractable and deadly consequences of a war with potential to affect the stability of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. This makes an even more compelling case for an external, independent, and impartial mechanism to address ongoing violations and accountability. As with all bodies mandated by the Human Rights Council, the Commission has been independent and impartial with no agenda regarding any of the parties to the conflict. We have consistently sought to engage with the federal government of Ethiopia, and we were pleased to meet with them and other stakeholders in a visit to Addis Ababa in late July of this year. Our meetings were constructive. Yet, despite the Council's request to all parties to provide the Commission with unhindered access and the goodwill expressed during our mission, we deeply regret that the federal government did not grant the Commission access to any areas outside of Addis Ababa. Mr. President, Excellencies, the Commission has conducted an in-depth investigation into 3 incidents and 2 thematic areas. The incidents examined were the shelling of Mekelle on 28 November 2020, and subsequent attacks on civilians and civilian objects. 2, killings in Kobo and Chena in late August and early September 2021. And 3, a drone strike on a camp for internally displaced persons in Dedebit on 7th January 2022. The themes examined were rape and sexual violence and the denial and obstruction of humanitarian access. Following the practices of other investigative mechanisms that were not granted access, the Commission interviewed 185 victims, survivors, witnesses, and other key interlocutors. 104 were women and girls, and 81 were men and boys. The Commission wishes to express respect for and appreciation to the survivors, victims, and witnesses who came forward to provide their testimonies at potential risk to themselves. The Commission also examined additional sources, including satellite imagery, print and audiovisual material, open source information, and confidential submissions. Following established practice, the Commission applied a standard of reasonable grounds to believe to its factual and legal findings. All of the Commission's findings met this standard. if information did not meet this standard, we reached no conclusion, and in some cases suggested the need for further investigation. Following this methodology, our report finds reasonable grounds to believe that parties to the conflict have committed serious violations and abuses of international human rights and humanitarian law since November 2020. We have reasonable grounds to believe that many of these acts amount to war crimes. We have also reasonable grounds to believe that the federal government and its allies have committed crimes against humanity in Tigray region. Some of these crimes are ongoing. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, we would like to highlight a number of key aspects of our conclusions. First, the report underscores the dire humanitarian situation in Tigray, where the federal government and its allies have denied some 6 million people access to basic services, including electricity, internet, telecommunications, and banking services for over a year. We have reasonable grounds to believe that the federal government and its allies have looted and destroyed goods indispensable for the survival of the civilian population in Tigray, killing livestock, destroying food stores, and raising crops while implementing severe restrictions on humanitarian access. Based on figures from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the combined effect of these measures has left 90% of the population in dire need of assistance, representing an 80% increase since the beginning of the conflict in the north. Most of the population in Tigray must now survive on limited and nutritionally inadequate diets. Sources also reported an increase in child marriages, child labor, human trafficking, and transactional sex as desperate means of survival. We have reasonable grounds to believe that the widespread denial and obstruction of access to basic services, food, healthcare, and humanitarian assistance amounts to the crime against humanity of persecution and inhumane acts. We also have reasonable grounds to believe that the federal government is committing the war crime of using starvation as a method of warfare. We received information indicating that Tigrayan forces have looted or otherwise misappropriated humanitarian aid. Secondly, the report finds reasonable grounds to believe that the Ethiopian Air Force committed war crimes, including intentionally directing an attack against civilians when it struck a camp for internally displaced persons in Dedabet with an armed drone in January 2022, killing around 60 civilians, including many children. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, the Ethiopian military's increasing use of drones to conduct airstrikes over the last year has changed the conflict landscape. In theory, drones should allow for more precise targeting of military objectives. However, our investigation indicates that their use has exposed civilians to new and heightened risks. We have received reports of drone strikes in Tigray in the last 4 weeks, which have allegedly killed and injured civilians, including children. Third, we have found reasonable grounds to believe that Tigrayan forces have committed serious human rights abuses, some of which amount to war crimes, including large-scale killings of Amhara civilians, rape and sexual violence, and widespread looting and destruction of civilian property in Kobo and Chena in August and September 2021. During their searches of homes in Kobo, for example, Tigrayan forces looked for weapons and pulled many men from their homes, executing them, often in front of their families. Fourth, the Commission also found that rape and crimes of sexual violence have been perpetrated on a staggering scale since the conflict began, with Ethiopian and Eritrean forces and regional militia targeting Tigrayan women and girls with particular violence and brutality. At times, the attackers used dehumanizing language that suggested an intent to destroy Tigrayan ethnicity. Tigrayan forces committed rape and sexual violence against Amhara women and girls and Eritrean refugees. Survivors from all areas face devastating long-term impacts on their physical and mental health, including trauma, unwanted pregnancy, and HIV. Fifth, we found that the federal government committed an indiscriminate attack on civilians when it shelled Mekelle on 28 November 2020. We investigated this incident because the JIT, on whose report we were supposed to build on, did not make a specific legal finding regarding the shelling, and because we received additional information regarding the attack. For the next 7 months, while the ENDF controlled the city, it carried out widespread extrajudicial killings, looting, rapes, and other forms of sexual violence. Mr. President, Excellencies, with respect to Ethiopian domestic mechanisms, we engaged constructively with the federal government's Interministerial Task Force and National Dialogue Commission. Our meeting with the task force was constructive, but we were not able to confirm much of the information provided. We recognize that some of the measures they put forth would, if implemented, contribute to transitional justice. The National Dialogue Commission is in early phases of its work, and as the process becomes more inclusive, we hope that it will contribute to national dialogue and peace. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, our report offers a number of recommendations to the federal government, the TPLF, the government of Eritrea, and other parties to the conflict, which can be summarized as follows. First, immediately cease hostilities and violations and abuses of international human rights and humanitarian law. This action will result in the protection of civilians. Second, investigate and bring to justice members of their own forces who have committed such violations of international human rights and humanitarian law in Ethiopia. Third, the federal government of Ethiopia must ensure full, unfettered, and sustained humanitarian access to Tigray. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, our report concludes that there are reasonable grounds to believe that many of the indicators and triggers contained in the 2014 United Nations Framework for Analysis of Atrocity Crimes are present in Ethiopia today, including the dissemination of hate speech and politicization of identity. The effect of these sentiments is apparent in the horrific and dehumanizing acts of violence committed during the conflict, which seem to go beyond mere intent to kill and instead reflect a desire to destroy. These fears of atrocity crimes makes it more important that our work is seen as a tool of prevention. Our work thus also complements the critical peace process that is currently led by the African Union, which seeks political, non-military solutions to the conflict in northern Ethiopia. It is our fervent hope that this process will succeed and lead to the restoration of peace, security, and full enjoyment of human rights in Ethiopia. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much for your work and the presentation of the report of the Commission. De acuerdo a nuestra práctica, comenzaremos por escuchar a la delegación del país concernido. Tiene la palabra el distinguido representante permanente de Etiopía. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia has been the subject of unfair and biased scrutiny at this august body for more than a year now. The activities around this council seems to be driven by a politically motivated and slanted narratives. Such misguided campaign against Ethiopia must stop at a time the government of Ethiopia is implementing the recommendations of the Joint Investigating Team. Ethiopia abides by its international human rights and international humanitarian law obligations, even at a time the country is confronting an insurrectionist armed group that has endangered the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country. Ethiopia remains firmly committed to human rights. The insurrectionist group is clearly intent on reversing the political and economic reforms being implemented by a popularly elected government and is trying to use violence to bring about unconstitutional change of government. Mr. President, from the outset, Ethiopia objected to the establishment of the Commission. The Commission was founded on a series of erroneous premises. Ironically, some members of this Council confess this and express regrets to us agreeing that this was politically motivated. Despite these reservations, however, the government engaged the Commission in a genuine effort of arriving at modalities that could have allowed us to work with the Commission. The Commission was adamant that its mandate is not confined to the conflict area but the whole country. It also wanted, as it did, to unnecessarily duplicate and undermine the work of the Joint Investigation Team. The Commission has submitted a report of substandard quality. Its allegations are unsubstantiated and not meeting the standard of proof for such investigations. It has fallen prey to those well accustomed to deceiving bodies of this nature. The report fails to meet a modicum of objectivity, professionalism, and impartiality. It makes grave accusations against the government and its armed forces without adducing proof, just based on telephone conversation and web-based submissions. This is irresponsible. This practice of targeting countries like Ethiopia ultimately undermines the authority and the credibility of the Human Rights Council. Without doubt, the report is selective and discriminatory, and its conclusions are politically motivated. The TPL bluntly violated the humanitarian truth, reigniting the conflict. It stole fuel destined for the delivery of humanitarian aid. It is absurd that the Commission tries to make the government sound like a culprit in this scenario. We believe there should be accountability and a safeguard to ensure that humanitarian aid will not be diverted to advancing the aggression of the TPLF. The Commission could have investigated atrocities committed by the TPLF in Amhara and Afar region. However, it only made fleeting references and also completely overlooked the use of child soldiers and the violent and forceful recruitment of fighters by the TPLF, including in refugee camps in neighboring countries. This calls into question the Commission's ability to shoulder this task objectively and impartially. A document containing our detailed response is distributed in English language, which was prepared based on the draft we received. The final version makes even more extreme allegations, going as far as divining the intent of our forces during the conflict. Mr. President, Ethiopia is taking concrete measures to bring perpetrators of human rights violations to justice. In this endeavor, we will continue working with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Ethiopia and other international partners. The Interministerial Task Force has published a preliminary report outlining its findings in relation to some of the areas affected by the conflict. Ethiopia is committed to peacefully resolve the conflict under the auspices of the African Union. The Commission's political pronouncement referring to the UN Security Council are ultra-virus and betray political motivations that go beyond human rights. We therefore call on the members of the Council to reject this report and to any attempt to extend the mandate of this Commission. I thank you.